In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, when the storm hit, no one believed a humble snow shelter could survive the fury of nature. But one man's ingenuity would defy every expectation, proving that sometimes the simplest solution is the strongest. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this stir your soul, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode uncovers even more wild survival tales that you won't want to miss. It was the first week of December when the snowstorm arrived, a monstrous white wall sweeping across the Appalachian wilderness. The wind howled through the trees, rattling branches like bones, while the snow piled up higher with each passing hour. There were no warnings, no forecasts to prepare anyone for what would unfold. For James Cooper, a rugged frontiersman who had spent the better part of his life learning to read the land, the storm wasn't the issue. He'd seen his fair share of blizzards, but this was different. As the wind began to twist in fury and the temperature plummeted, he could feel the mountain tremble. There was a quiet terror in the air. He had been traveling with a small group of fellow trappers, intent on reaching their camp before nightfall. But the storm had turned the landscape into an icy labyrinth, where nothing looked familiar and every step felt like an eternity. When visibility dropped to mere feet, he knew the only thing to do was find shelter fast. "Don't matter how well you know the mountains," he muttered under his breath, his thick, wind-scorched beard tugging against the harsh gusts. Sometimes, nature makes it clear who's in charge. They stumbled upon a snow shelter, an old style of structure he had seen used in the far north, but never thought to employ himself. It was built from the snow itself, with a curved, sturdy roof and an entrance barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. For most people, a snow shelter was an afterthought, something you'd use in an emergency. But here, in the wilderness, with no firewood and no shelter of their own, this oddity became their only hope. James knew they didn't have the luxury of time. The storm had set in for the long haul. And this shelter, built from nothing but snow and a few branches, was their only chance to survive the night. As the group huddled inside, James couldn't help but admire the simplicity of the shelter. There were no logs, no stone foundations, just the ingenious use of nature's most abundant resource. It made him realize that perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't always the finest craftsmanship that made a structure strong, but the understanding of what nature truly demanded. That night, as the storm raged outside, James sat at the entrance, watching the snow build up. He had built many cabins, and every time he had relied on stone and wood. But here, in the heart of the storm, something about the snow shelter felt different. The roof didn't cave in under the pressure. The walls didn't crack. It held, perfectly, against nature's wrath. It was then that James knew this shelter wasn't just a temporary fix. It was a revelation. As the storm continued its relentless assault, James began to study the shelter in a way he had never studied his cabins. Each piece of the snow shelter, each carefully placed layer of snow and ice seemed to have its purpose. The roof was low and curved, designed to shed snow easily, while the compactness of the walls prevented the cold air from seeping inside. The insulation was perfect, and despite the fierce winds battering the entrance, the temperature inside remained surprisingly bearable. James had never thought much about snow shelters before. He had always believed that only a solid log cabin could withstand the harshest elements of the wilderness. But now, here he was, staring at the result of something built with little more than snow, branches, and the deep knowledge of how to work with nature instead of against it. As dawn broke, the storm subsided. The group ventured outside, their breaths forming clouds in the frigid air. James stepped into the snow, crunching through the powder to inspect the shelter from the outside. The structure had withstood an entire night of violent winds and deep snowfall, and yet it was still standing tall. No cracks, no leaks, just solid, unfazed snow. The contrast between the shelter and the cabins he had built with his own hands was staggering. The cabins, which had always been his pride and joy, were nothing compared to this. He had always prided himself on building something strong, something that could withstand the harshest winters and the fiercest storms. But in truth, he now realized he had been building against nature, not with it. James couldn't help but think about his past experiences, how he had spent so much of his life building cabins with thick logs and heavy tools, only to find that the cold and the snow always found a way in. This snow shelter, however, was different. It was made of the very thing that threatened their lives, yet it stood firm, as if nature itself had embraced the challenge. He gathered the group together. "We've made it through this night, thanks to this shelter," he said, his voice steady. "I've spent my life building cabins out of wood and stone, thinking that would make me safe. But I'm starting to think there's more to surviving these storms than what we can build with our hands." For the first time in years, James felt a deep sense of respect for the raw power of nature. In this simple snow shelter, he had found something more valuable than the strongest cabin or the sturdiest logs. He had found a lesson in humility and in the art of working with nature, not against it. The morning after the storm, the group moved cautiously through the now quiet wilderness, the weight of the night's ordeal still hanging in the air. The snow shelter had been a blessing, but the journey wasn't over yet. There was no time to rest. They needed to reach their destination, the trappers' camp, which lay a day's journey ahead, if the weather would allow it. James felt a shift in his thoughts as they walked. The storm had revealed something fundamental to him. Survival in these mountains wasn't just about building strong walls, it was about knowing when to adapt, when to listen to the land, and when to work with it rather than against it. For a moment, he recalled the early days when he first arrived in these mountains, a young man eager to prove himself. He had learned quickly, carving out a life by building log cabins and trapping beavers along the frozen streams. Those were the days when he'd felt invincible, when his hands could shape the wilderness to his will. But over time, things had changed. The winters grew colder. The storms became fiercer. The land seemed to fight back, and no matter how strong the cabin or how sharp the axe, the wilderness had a way of finding weakness. That's why, in recent years, James had become more cautious, more methodical. His cabins had become larger, sturdier, fortified against every threat he could imagine. But they were still vulnerable. Now, after the storm, he understood that maybe all his years of hard labor hadn't prepared him for what nature demanded. It wasn't about outbuilding the mountain, it was about respecting it. The snow shelter wasn't the first time he had encountered the concept of snow homes. He had heard old-timers speak of it in passing, but it had always seemed like something too simple, too temporary, a mere band-aid for survival in dire circumstances. But now, with a renewed sense of awe, he began to reconsider. That afternoon, as they stopped to rest in a sheltered grove, James took a moment to reflect. The old way of doing things, the way of cutting and shaping logs, of constructing buildings meant to last for decades, wasn't the only way to survive. There was an elegance in simplicity, a form of ingenuity in working with the environment, not just in mastering it. He noticed the way the snow around them had already begun to harden under the cold touch of the mountain air. The flurry of snowflakes had stopped, but the ground was still slick and treacherous. As he sat there, he began to sketch in his mind how a shelter like the one they had used could be adapted for longer-term use, not just as a temporary escape from the storm, but as a reliable home for a man alone or in a small group. For the first time in years, he realized there was wisdom in returning to simpler ways, in using the environment to its fullest potential, rather than trying to fight against it. The snow shelter was a temporary fix, but it showed him that survival didn't have to be a war with nature. Perhaps, he thought, the solution wasn't in making things bigger and stronger, but in understanding them better. The days that followed were filled with a different kind of focus. Instead of heading straight to their camp, James spent hours examining the landscape, walking the perimeter of the shelter, and learning its secrets. The snow shelter had revealed the possibility of building something far more efficient, far more in tune with the land than any log cabin ever could be. He wasn't the only one to notice the shift. The other trappers in his group began to understand too, though they couldn't help but remain skeptical. The idea of abandoning their log cabins for something as temporary as a snow shelter was difficult to swallow. They had all seen the weather turn vicious over the years, and they were creatures of habit, firm believers in the durability of their cabins, the work they had put into constructing them. But James couldn't shake the feeling that there was something here, something worth exploring. He wanted to see how far he could push this concept, how much more it could offer. Could it be that the most durable shelter didn't require hours of labor, vast quantities of wood, or the sharpest tools? Could a man survive winters here not through brute force, but by understanding how nature worked and responding accordingly? That evening, as the group sat around their campfire, James spoke up. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low but steady. The others turned to him, their faces lit by the flickering flames. "What if we started using the snow more intentionally? What if we didn't just build with logs and stone? What if we worked with what the land gives us naturally?" One of the men, Thomas, raised an eyebrow. "You mean build more of those damn snow huts?" James chuckled. "Not exactly. But the idea is close. What if we combine the snow shelter technique with some of the things we've learned over the years? I've seen men struggle in the snow, freezing to death in cabins that weren't built. Right, I've been that man." There was silence around the fire as they all absorbed his words. The fire crackled, and the wind whispered through the trees, a constant reminder of the mountain's power. "I don't think this is just about building better cabins," James continued. "It's about learning to respect the land, to understand its patterns. We don't need to fight against nature, we need to work with it. The shelters we've been building, they've been too rigid, too permanent. Nature doesn't care about permanence. It changes, it moves, and if we're going to survive here, we need to do the same." The conversation shifted after that, moving slowly at first, but gaining momentum. James was convinced that there was more to learn, more to discover. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, they began to experiment with smaller, more adaptable shelters, combining their trapping knowledge with the lessons the storm had taught them. By the time they reached the trappers' camp days later, James had a plan. It wasn't just about surviving the next storm or the next winter. It was about creating something sustainable. Something that didn't just rely on the weight of timber and stone to stand strong, but on the simplicity of understanding how to make nature work for you. In that camp, James began to lay the foundations of a new way forward, one where man's ingenuity worked in harmony with the environment rather than against it. And in doing so, he would change the course of survival on the Appalachian frontier forever. The weeks that followed James's revelation were filled with a sense of purpose. He and the rest of the group returned to their daily routines of trapping and foraging, but his mind never left the idea of rethinking shelter. Each step he took in the snow seemed to guide him deeper into this new philosophy. There were risks. Of course, if he was wrong, it could cost him his life, but the promise of a shelter that truly worked with the wilderness kept pulling him forward. As they journeyed back into the mountains, James began to experiment with variations of the snow shelter technique. He wanted to see if it could be refined, made more permanent without sacrificing the natural advantages it offered. The group had all but dismissed the idea of abandoning their traditional log cabins, but James knew better. He understood the need for practicality, especially in an environment where survival hinged on the ability to adapt, and that meant breaking free from old patterns. One evening, after a long day of trapping, James began work on a new structure near their camp. He chose a sheltered, quiet area beside a large ridge where the wind wouldn't be a threat. The others watched curiously, though they remained skeptical. Their gaze often flicked from the pile of snow he was shaping to their familiar cabins in the distance. James worked methodically, carving the snow into an intricate, dome-shaped shelter similar to what he had experienced before but with significant improvements. He layered the snow in thick slabs, packing them tightly together. Then he began to build small branches into the roof, reinforcing the structure. The shelter had no walls, but the dome shape provided enough insulation to protect against the cold and wind. The real test would come the following night. James had intentionally built the structure too large to be a temporary snow shelter. It had to withstand more than just the weight of snow, it had to endure a full Appalachian winter. He wasn't building this for survival alone, he was building it to prove a point, that shelter didn't always have to come from wood or stone. That night, as the temperature dropped, James and his companions crawled inside, the fire from their camp casting long shadows against the walls of snow. The wind howled, a shrieking reminder that they were at the mercy of the elements. But as the hours passed, inside the shelter, it remained warm and still. There was a hum of satisfaction in James's chest as he lay there, the cold outside, but the shelter holding firm against the storm. By morning, The storm had grown fiercer, but the shelter had endured. The others, previously dismissive, now began to see the advantages of what James had built. The snow, when packed tightly and treated properly, formed a barrier that no cold wind could pierce. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was far from the temporary fleeting shelter they'd initially thought it to be. James could feel the spark of something new igniting in him. This wasn't just about the shelter, it was about reshaping the way people thought about survival. In this quiet, snowbound place, far from civilization, he had built something that had withstood nature's worst, proving that a new kind of frontier ingenuity was not only possible but necessary. As the days passed, James found himself more and more consumed with refining his idea. What had begun as a simple, urgent need to protect his small group from the storm had blossomed into something far greater. He felt a deep sense of responsibility. He wasn't just building for himself anymore. He was building for anyone who would listen, anyone who would take the time to see the value in what he was trying to create. One evening, after a long day of hunting, the group gathered around their campfire as James sketched out plans in the dirt. His hand moved quickly, drawing circles and lines, showing how the snow shelter could be improved with more ingenuity. But there was a new energy in his words, a vision that extended far beyond the immediate future. "I've been thinking," James said, his voice carrying over the crackling fire. "We're wasting so much time fighting the land when we should be working with it. If we could make these shelters more durable, make them last longer, we could have something more than just a winter refuge. We could have homes." Thomas, who had always been the most skeptical, spoke up. "Homes? Out of snow? You're talking about winter cabins made of ice?" James shook his head. "Not ice, no, snow, properly packed and shaped. It's all about the structure. We've got plenty of snow, plenty of trees. We don't need to go cutting down more wood or hauling heavy timber. There's a simplicity to this method that could change everything." The rest of the group was quiet, though they were intrigued. They had seen the shelter hold up through a fierce storm. They had felt the warmth inside when the wind outside could have frozen them to the bone. But the thought of using this method in a more permanent way was beyond what they had imagined. James continued undeterred. "We can build a shelter that will last, that can withstand the cold of the mountain winters without the weight and labor of traditional cabins. A snow structure reinforced with wood, designed to adapt as the weather shifts. If we can get this right, it's not just a shelter anymore. It's a new way of living here, of surviving." The idea lingered in the air, heavy and transformative. The fire flickered and popped as if in agreement. Over the next few days, James and the others worked together, improving upon the initial design. They took turns gathering branches to reinforce the structure, used extra snow to build up the walls, and shaped the entrance to be more wind-resistant. Every adjustment seemed to bring them closer to something revolutionary. Though the idea was still new and the design was far from perfect, it was clear that this was a beginning. The more they worked, the more they realized that this wasn't just about surviving another storm, it was about thriving in a land that demanded everything from you, and sometimes gave little back. James had started with a simple shelter, born out of necessity. Now, he had begun to create something far more valuable, a new kind of home, born from the wilderness, that could stand the test of time. As winter settled in with its full, unrelenting force, James's snow shelter began to show its true worth. The landscape, once lush with the promise of spring, had transformed into an endless white expanse of ice and snow. The temperatures plummeted to a bitter cold, and the winds howled through the mountain passes. But the group, now converted to James' way of thinking, stood proudly inside their newly fortified shelter, a testament to ingenuity and adaptation. The storm that had once felt like an adversary now felt like an ally. The heavier the snow fell, the more the shelter strengthened, compacting with each new layer of snow. With every gust of wind, the structure settled deeper into the earth, gaining both strength and insulation. This wasn't just a temporary solution to a passing storm, it was holding its own against the full brunt of an Appalachian winter. James spent his days observing the shelter, making small adjustments to ensure it continued to endure. The others had begun to see the beauty of the design as well. No longer were they chopping wood in the bitter cold or struggling to keep their cabins warm. Inside the snow shelter, there was a sense of peace that had never been present in their log cabins. The walls, once a source of anxiety, now felt like a protective cocoon, keeping out the harsh winds and snow. One evening, as the snowstorm outside intensified, James ventured out to check the traps he had set along the ridge. The wind had picked up, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But the snow shelter, nestled among the trees, stood tall, its simple yet powerful structure unaffected by the fury of the elements. When he returned, frost clinging to his beard, the group was gathered around the fire inside the shelter, a quiet camaraderie forming as they shared stories and food. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to relax. The relentless tension of survival had eased, but just as he began to feel the satisfaction of their success, a loud cracking sound pierced the night. Everyone froze, eyes wide with fear. "It's the roof," someone whispered. "The snow's too much." James rushed to the entrance, his heart pounding. He had built this shelter with the thought that it would be impervious, but there was always that lingering doubt, the nagging fear that something would go wrong. He stepped outside into the cold night, squinting into the swirling snowstorm. To his relief, the roof had held. The cracking noise had come not from structural failure but from the deep, slow compression of the snow, a natural consequence of the shelter's construction. It wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign that the shelter was continuing to adapt and hold firm against the storm. Inside, the group released a collective breath. The shelter, though not perfect, was proving itself to be stronger than anything they could have hoped for. As the wind howled and the snow piled up outside, they huddled close, knowing that they were safe for the moment and perhaps for much longer than that. The weeks passed quickly, and the shelter, now covered in a thick blanket of snow, stood as a beacon of success amid the harsh conditions. The others in the group began to feel a sense of ownership over the structure. It was no longer just James's project, it was theirs too. They had come to realize that this wasn't simply about surviving the winter. It was about creating a way of life that could sustain them, year after year, without the need for constant rebuilding or constant battle with nature. One afternoon, as James was reinforcing the walls of the shelter, a group of trappers approached the camp. They had been traveling for days, having heard rumors of a new way of building shelters that could withstand the fiercest storms. The news had spread like wildfire through the nearby trapping communities, and the prospect of a more efficient, sustainable shelter was too enticing to ignore. James met them at the entrance, his eyes narrowing as he sized them up. They were a rugged bunch, hardened by years of living in the wilderness, but there was an underlying curiosity in their eyes. "You're James Cooper, right?" one of them asked. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. James nodded. "That's me. What brings you out here?" The trapper grinned. "Heard tell of your snow shelters. Thought we'd come see for ourselves." James smiled, a hint of pride creeping into his expression. "Come on in, see for yourselves." As the group entered the shelter, the trappers exchanged glances, clearly impressed by what they saw. The warmth of the shelter was immediate, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The fire crackled in the center, casting flickering shadows on the walls. There was a sense of comfort, of safety, something that traditional log cabins often lack during the harshest winters. After a few moments of silence, one of the trappers spoke up. "We've been building cabins out here for years. We thought we knew every trick to surviving in these mountains. But this is something else." James leaned against the wall, feeling a sense of satisfaction. "It's not magic. It's just about understanding the land, how the snow works, how the cold moves, how nature adapts. We're not trying to fight it. We're trying to live with it." The group fell silent, taking in his words. They could see the truth in them, feel the logic in his approach. Over the next few hours, James shared his techniques with them, explaining how he had learned to combine the snow shelter with the skills he had developed over the years. He showed them the small adjustments that made all the difference. How he reinforced the walls with branches. How he shaped the roof to shed snow efficiently. How he used the natural flow of air to keep the shelter warm without a massive fire. By the end of the day, the group had a newfound respect for James and his snow shelter. Word had already begun to spread throughout the trapping communities, and soon more men would come, eager to learn this new way of building shelter. James knew that this was just the beginning. He had created something that had the potential to change the way people thought about survival in the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't just about building shelter, it was about building a relationship with the land, a relationship that would last for generations to come. As the trappers left that evening, promising to share what they had learned with others, James couldn't help but feel a deep sense of accomplishment. The mountains had always been his home, and now he had found a way to live in them more harmoniously than ever before. The snow shelter, once a desperate experiment, had now become a symbol of innovation, survival, and, above all, the resilience of the human spirit. As winter continued to press its icy grip on the land, James saw something change in the trappers who had come to learn his methods. They returned to their camps, their minds full of the possibilities James had shown them. Over the next few months, one by one, more men came seeking knowledge, drawn not just by the shelter itself, but by the idea of survival through adaptation. James was no longer alone in his vision. The snow shelters began to spread through the mountain communities like wildfire, each new shelter a testament to the power of innovation over brute force. The days of endless log cutting and exhausting cabin building were slowly becoming a thing of the past, replaced by shelters built in harmony with the environment. But James knew it wasn't just about the shelters anymore. The real lesson lay in the process of learning to live with nature rather than against it. The snow shelter wasn't just a refuge from the storm, it was a new way of thinking about survival, one that looked at the land not as something to conquer, but something to understand. As the snow began to thaw, James looked back at the network of snow shelters that had sprouted across the mountains. He knew the legacy of these shelters would stretch far beyond this winter. The men who had learned from him would pass the knowledge down to their children, and the children would carry it with them into the future. He had given them more than just a way to survive the winter. He had given them a new relationship with the wilderness, a relationship based on respect and understanding. Spring came slowly to the Appalachian Mountains, the snow beginning to melt and reveal the rich green of the earth beneath. James stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as the last of the winter's grip faded away. The snow shelters, now hardened into permanent structures, had withstood the harshest winter in recent memory. As the seasons changed, so too did the world around him, and James found himself reflecting on the journey he had started. The knowledge of the snow shelter had spread far beyond his original group of trappers. Even settlers passing through the mountains had begun to use it, building shelters for themselves and their families. James had unwittingly started a movement, one that had brought people closer to the land, teaching them to live with it rather than resist it. He knew that the true test of his idea would come not in the shelter's ability to endure a single winter, but in its ability to adapt to the future. The wilderness was unpredictable, and survival was never guaranteed. But in the snow shelter, there was a lesson he knew would last. James wasn't just a mountain man anymore. He had become a part of the land, and his legacy would be written in the snow and trees, in the hearts of those who learned the true meaning of resilience. As the sun dipped below the mountains, James felt a quiet pride. The wilderness was still as untamed as ever, but now it seemed a little more welcoming. A place where survival was not just about outlasting the storm, but about learning to thrive within it.